Does the US president have too much power? I would argue yes, indeed he does. And what I'm going to put forth is an argument that the US president today has far too much power, grounded in Matwa Lysander Spooner. Matwa Spooner, especially his reading of the US Constitution. And what I'm going to argue is that the US president's power is itself in violation of the US Constitution. And so let us begin. My first premise, the Constitution must be interpreted in a way most consistent with liberty. That is essentially what Spooner first argued. Matwa Spooner argued that in arguing against slavery, that any good faith interpretation of the Constitution, the US Constitution that is, must lean towards liberty first and foremost, lest the Republic and its promise be a lie, because the rhetoric around the founding of the US and so on and so forth was all about liberty. So that's number one. Number two, he also has a natural law argument, which, I can get into another time. Number two, no enormous powers, such as enslaving people or waging aggressive war, can be assumed unless explicitly granted. And so the US Constitution, we have to ask ourselves, does it grant that power? So premise three, the US Constitution does not explicitly grant the US government unlimited global military authority. There is nowhere in the US Constitution that says that what Donald Trump is doing at present is perfectly fine and dandy, and in fact, a good faith reading would say the opposite. Remember, George Washington himself talked about not getting involved in, quote, entangling alliances. So, therefore, the conclusion that I would draw based upon Matwa Spooner's reading of the US Constitution is the expansion of US military power, especially undeclared or preventative wars, represents an unconstitutional assumption of authority. That is essentially what I'm arguing here. So let us sort of flesh this out more, give this more flesh, more body, so to speak. And so let's sort of get into number one, okay? So, these are the things that I'm sort of using Matwa Spooner for. Number one, his rules of constitutional interpretation. Number two, his claim that the Constitution of the US protects natural liberty. And three, his critique that government power easily becomes illegitimate when it exceeds those limits. So let us get into premise one. Spooner's key principle: the Constitution must be read in favor of liberty. So Matwa Spooner argued, and most famously in his book The Unconstitutionality of Slavery, that the US Constitution must always be interpreted in a way most consistent with liberty and natural rights. So he insisted that when legal language has multiple possible meanings, courts must choose the one compatible with justice and freedom. Okay? That's what he argued. So his reasoning, the Constitution never explicitly authorizes slavery. Therefore, courts cannot infer such a massive violation of natural rights from vague language, and any interpretation allowing oppression must be rejected. And so, in other words, no enormous power over human liberty may be assumed unless it is explicitly granted. That's his first point. His second point, applying Matwa Spooner's method to state power. So if we apply Matwa Spooner's interpretive rule consistently, the Constitution must be interpreted against coercion and against unjust domination. The federal government therefore cannot claim broad powers unless they are clearly stated. This creates a strict standard. If a government power risks violating natural liberty, it must have clear textual authorization. This is precisely the logic Matwa Spooner used against the evil institution of slavery. So that is point number 2. Number 3, war, power, and foreign conflict under Martin Spooner's logic. So if we apply that logic to US military action against Iran, the current war, step 1, the Constitution grants limited war powers. Congress can declare war and fund armies, but it does not grant unlimited authority to wage undeclared wars, police the world, maintain permanent military domination abroad. From Matua Spooner's standpoint, such a sweeping power would drastically threaten liberty. Therefore, it cannot be assumed without explicit constitutional authorization. Step 2. Excessive power violates constitutional principles. So, Matua Spooner's anti-slavery argument rests on this principle. If the Constitution protects liberty, it cannot be interpreted to authorize systems of domination. Applying that logic, massive centralized military power, undeclared wars, and executive war making all resemble the same kind of inferred authority he rejected in slavery debates. So again, Donald Trump is relying upon inferred, not explicit authority in order to get away with what he's doing. And so, just as slavery supporters inferred authority from vague clauses, modern governments infer authority from vague claims like national security, commander-in-chief, collective defense, etc. Spooner would reject those interpretations unless clearly stated. Matua Spooner's deeper argument, government power easily becomes tyranny. So, this is one of the things that he argued, especially in No Treason. Matua Spooner argued that governments routinely expand power beyond legitimate consent. So his view was that the US Constitution was supposedly based on the consent of, quote, the people, end of quote, but that consent is mostly fictional. Governments often use force in ways people never agreed to. Thus, large-scale wars or foreign interventions would be suspect because individuals never consented to them. They require taxation and coercion, and they risk violating natural rights. Finally, the analogy that Matua Spooner would likely draw. This is sort of the analogy that he would make. So, Matua Spooner argued that slavery existed only because people read power into the Constitution that was not there. The same critique can be made about empire. So we can sort of, if we think about it, we can sort of put them side by side of one another. So pro-slavery lawyers inferred slavery from vague clauses. Matua Spooner, liberty must be presumed. Therefore, no explicit authorization, unconstitutional. We can use a parallel argument. So governments infer war powers from vague authority. Liberty should limit militarized power. Therefore, no explicit authorization means it is unconstitutional. In short, using Matua Spooner's interpretive method, I am arguing that expansive US military power, including conflicts like the recent one in Iran, rest on the same type of implied authority that he rejected in the defense of slavery. So that implied authority needed to defend slavery, he rejected it, saying that that violates liberty, and I couldn't agree more. We need to reject the implied authority that Donald Trump and his predecessors like Obama drew upon and draw upon presently. We need to reject that because it is not explicit in the US Constitution. Again, it's inferred, just like slavery was inferred. And I personally think that inferring power to engage in imperialism and to harm civilians is incredibly evil, in the same way that inferring power to be able to engage in the evil practice of slavery is itself evil. It needs to be stood up against.